Welcome back. Now, it's pretty exciting that our bot is spawning in our beams, but typically when a bot spawns in a beam like this, there's some kind of additional effect at the point of spawning, some kind of explosion of particles, and that's what we're interested in this video. We're going to make a particle system. Specifically, we're going to make a Niagara system. Niagara is the visual effects system in Unreal Engine 5. It's new and improved. There used to be an old particle effects creation system called Cascade, but that's slowly being phased out in favor of Niagara. Now, we're going to create our own basic Niagara system just to get our feet wet in visual effects creation in this video. So we're going to go to our assets folder, and let's make a new folder called FX. You could also call it the whole word effects. And in effects, we're going to create a Niagara system. And we can do that by right-clicking and going down to FX and finding Niagara system. A Niagara system is a system of emitters. Each emitter is its own type of object. We're going to make a Niagara system, and when we do that, when we select that, we get a menu that allows us to choose an emitter or system as a base. So there are a number of default systems that already exist that we can start with, or we could start from scratch. If we wanted to start from scratch, we can choose completely empty and then easily add a new emitter to our system later. Let's just start with a completely empty system just to see what it looks like with nothing in it. Let's click on Create. And I'm going to prefix this asset with NS for Niagara System, and I'm going to call this Beam Burst. NS Beam Burst. Let's go ahead and double click on that to open it up. And here's what the Niagara editor looks like. We have our own little viewport here, and we have a number of menus. This can look a little overwhelming, but that's okay. We're going to take a look at each thing one at a time. The first node called NS Beam Burst, it has the same name as our Niagara system because this is our overall system node. Properties on this node apply to the whole system as a whole. And then next to it, we have another node called Completely Empty. This is an emitter. It has nothing in it. We can even delete it if we wanted to by hitting delete, and we could also add a new emitter by right-clicking and choosing Add Emitter. Now, the reason I deleted that completely empty node was because I want to start with one of these template emitters. I know we created a completely empty Niagara system. I just wanted to show you what that looks like, but I want to start from a starting point. So let's get one of these. I'm going to choose Omnidirectional Burst. So click on that, click on Add, and we now have a new emitter in our system called Omnidirectional Burst. And if we look in our viewport, we can see that this is what it looks like. It's playing over and over again on loop. And down here, we have a timeline at the bottom showing us the timeline for our particle system as it's playing. And we can click on pause, we can click on play, we can even play it in reverse to see what that looks like. But I'm just going to keep it on play. And our emitter is basically showing us a bunch of particles that are bursting out in all directions. Now, what are these particles? They're actually just sprites. A sprite is a flat plane with an image rendered constantly facing the user or the viewer. And that sprite is determined by a material. So what is that material? Well, we can see by going to the bottom of our emitter, clicking on Sprite Renderer, and we can see under Sprite Renderer, we have our material, and it's just this basic material. It's like a white dot. And that's what we see here in our viewport, a bunch of white dots. And you can right click and drag to zoom in and out and rotate around and see what this system looks like from different angles. And I'm going to zoom in and show you that each of these dots is just this material. We can click Browse To, and we'll see that this material is in the engine content, which is a folder that's hidden by default. But since we browse to it, now it's going to be visible. Engine content contains a whole lot of stuff, including this default sprite material. And we can even double click to open it and see what it looks like here in the material editor. And we can click on the plane to see the preview mesh set to plane. And this is that sprite. This is a simple material, relatively, and it's just a white dot that fades out at the edges. I'm going to go ahead and close it, but that's just to show you what this looks like. It's just a simple material, and we're spawning a whole bunch of little planes, basically, that have this material on it. Now, the emitter has a number of modules, and these can be added and removed to customize what this emitter looks like. And they're in different categories. Emitter update. These are things that occur every emitter tick on the CPU. So these emitters do tick. We have a particle spawn system where we can set things for when the particle is first spawned. By particle, we mean each individual piece, each individual sprite. And we have particle update, which is a set of modules that are acting on these particles every frame. Now, because this is an omnidirectional burst emitter, it has an emitter update module called Spawn Burst Instantaneous, and this determines how many of these sprite particles will be spawned, and it's just a burst. It only happens once. We just happen to be showing that burst over and over again because, well, we're looping down here, but we can change the spawn count. It's set to 100 by default. If we set it to 1, we'll only get a single particle. We might have to zoom out to see, but we can see that it's spawning one particle. Notice it's flying in different directions every time. There's a random element to this. We can change it to 5, and we can see that now there's 5 particles. And we could change it to 1,000 if we want to see what that looks like, or 10,000. I'll go ahead and leave it at 100 for now. So that is how we determine how many particles are spawned. Now, initialize particle is where we can set a whole bunch of properties for each particle. Notice lifetime mode has a drop-down. We can set the lifetime for each particle directly, or we can have a random distribution. We'll get a random value between the min and max. So setting it to direct set and using a single value such as 0.1 seconds, we'll see that all of those particles die after 0.1 seconds, but setting it to random allows us to have a different lifetime per particle, and each of those is going to be relatively short. I'm going to set the min to 0.1 and the maximum to 0.2 to see what that looks like. And we can see that some of the particles expand farther out because they live longer, and some of them only live 0.1 seconds, and most of them live a lifetime somewhere between these two values. Now, before I go on and start messing with the values, I want to see what this particle system looks like in the world relative to other objects like our drone. And to see what it looks like, we can drag one of them in. I'm going to collapse that engine folder. In fact, I don't want to see that anymore. To hide engine content, we go up to Settings, the gear icon on our content drawer, and we uncheck Show Engine Content to hide that again. We can always get it back by coming back and checking the checkbox. But I'm going to go to Effects, get my NS Beam Burst, and bring it in to the world. And I'd like to see what it looks like in the game. Now, I can play without possessing any pawn by simply clicking the 3 dots next to play and choosing Simulate. If I do that, we'll start the game without actually possessing a pawn. And that allows me to see what the particles look like. So as you can see, the particle burst is quite large. It's almost the size of our drone itself. That may be what you want. It may be too large. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the lifetime min and set it to 0.05 and the lifetime max to 0.15. So it's going to be slightly smaller, and we can barely see it because it's so short-lived. So I might actually make that lifetime min still 0.1 and the max about 0.16 or so. Here in Initialize Particle, we can also set the color of the particle as well. And if you'd like it to be red, we can change it to red. notice that it's not very exciting, but we can overdrive the red and make it very, very red by taking our red value and changing it to, say, 100. That's going to make it glow a little bit more. We're overdriving the value. I like to set it to about 200, actually. I think that looks pretty good. Now, just so it's easier to see these particles while developing, I think I'm going to set that lifetime min and max to larger values like 0.2 to 0.4. I think that looks pretty good. Let's see what it looks like in the level. It's pretty big, but we'll adjust that later. So now we have a nice looking burst. Now let's go down to some of these other modules. Under particle spawn, we have a shape location, and it has a shape primitive set to sphere. This means we're going to spawn these particles inside of a sphere with the specified radius. If I increase that radius, we're going to spawn those particles from within a larger sphere. And if we make this really small, like 5, it's going to spawn those particles in from within a sphere of radius 5. I'm going to make it really small. I'm going to give it a radius of 2. And now we see that we're spawning from within a tiny little area. Now notice we can see that they're kind of going upward, right? And that's because of the next module, add velocity. We're adding a velocity from a point. Now, the reason these particles are mostly going upward is because our origin for our velocity has an offset. It's set to -7. I'm going to set that to 0, so our velocity origin is at the center, and so all particles are going to fly out away from the center. And I'm going to set that velocity minimum to about 200 and the velocity maximum to about 500, so we get a bit of a higher velocity. Now notice that our particles are just little round balls, but I'd like them to be stretched to align with their velocity. And to do that, we can go back down to Sprite Renderer and go to its alignment property. And from the dropdown, we can choose velocity aligned. If we do that, then our particles will be aligned to their velocity. And if we change their size to be longer in their own forward direction, we'll get an interesting looking effect. Let's go back to initialize particle to sprite size mode. And we can change the size of these particles. Right now we're set to random uniform, but if we change it to random non-uniform, we now have X and Y. So we can have them stretched out in their own X and Y directions. I'm going to put 0.1 for X, 0.1 for Y, and now they're much smaller. 0.1 might be too small. Let's try 0.5 and 0.5 and zoom in a little bit. And here we see what that looks like. I'm going to set them to 1 and 1, maybe 2 and 2. And we see what they look like at that size. Now, I'd like to stretch them. So if I set the Y instead of 2 to maybe 6, now we can see that they're stretching in their own Y direction. So that looks pretty nice. Now, another option is to set Y to 2 and X to a larger value such as 6. And now we get this kind of an effect, which looks a little bit different. So play with these values until you get an effect that you like. You may like this kind of effect. You may like it to stretch in the other direction, the direction they're flying in, to look more like an actual explosion. I'm going to use values of 2 and 8 respectively. Let's see what that looks like in the world. That looks pretty good. And at this point, I'm going to try a shorter lifetime, 0.1 to 0.2, to get a smaller burst, and that's looking pretty nice. So we've now created our own basic emitter, and the cool thing is we can duplicate this emitter node and change the duplicate. I'm just going to select it and use Control D to duplicate it, and we have a second burst. Now, both of these are copies of each other, so really we just have twice as many particles that are basically doing the same thing, but we can isolate these with the icon here that says Enable Isolation for this emitter. I'm going to click on that so we only see this one, and I'm going to change this one a bit. I'm going to go to Initialize Particle and change its color to a more orange or maybe yellow. So we have something like this, and I'm going to change the sprite size. I'm going to have a larger value for X, say 8, and a smaller value for Y, say 1. So we have this kind of effect. And if we unselect emitter isolation, we can see what these both look like together. And we get a pretty nice effect that way. I'm going to take that color and make it a little bit more on the orange side, like so. And I think that's looking already pretty nice. And of course, there are lots of other properties we can play with if we like. Drag is a nice one. Increasing the drag makes those particles slow a little bit as they're flying outward. We also have scale color, which makes the color scale along its lifetime. Now, the lifetime has a minimum of about 0.1, and notice this curve goes all the way to 1 second. So if you want to use this curve, the timeline is going to need to coincide with its lifetime more closely. We can change the X value, that's time, and the Y value is the value for the color. Specifically, it's scaling the alpha, so the color fades out with time. Play with that if you like. And of course, we also have gravity force set to -980 by default. That means gravity pulls these particles downward. If you disable that, set it to 0, there will be no gravity. So if you want that kind of effect, you can have that as well. And I always frequently come back into the world and see what it looks like in the level next to an object for reference as well. So now we have a nice looking particle. And you can have as many emitters as you like. For instance, I can take my first one, duplicate it yet again, and have another one just because I can. And I'm going to take the initialized particle and set the color to completely white. And I'm going to overdrive those colors even more, though, by setting them all to 400. So now we have a nice white, but I don't want as many. So I'm going to go to Spawn Burst Instantaneous and change it to 20. So there's only 20 of these. And I'm going to take my size here in Initialize Particle, and I'm going to have a random non-uniform size with 1 for the X and 6 for the Y. I'm going to isolate it so I can see what that looks like. Here it is. And I don't want any gravity force, so rather than just setting its Z to 0, I can simply uncheck that module, so it's no longer being used. And if I want to remove it completely, I can simply delete it with the delete key as well. So now I have some white here, and I'm going to set its shape location to a little bit larger of a radius, like 5, and unisolate it to see what my particle system looks like, and that's looking pretty nice. Okay, so now we have a bit of experience creating Niagara systems. As you can see, there's a whole lot of things you can do. We've just barely scratched the surface, but we now have an effect that we can use. And in the next video, we're going to use it in our bot by spawning one of these systems at the location where we're spawning our beams, right at the tip of the barrel of our drone's rifle. So excellent job, and I'll see you soon.